Hello and welcome to the Wire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today we'll discuss this week's action from around the league, including several injury updates. We'll also discuss some of the top waiver-wire pickups for this week. And finally, we'll preview the week ahead, which is the start of the fantasy playoffs. Even though the WNBA season is now winding down, fantasy football draft season is in full swing, and you can use the code YouTube15 to get 15% off any RotoWire subscription. We have plenty of new and exciting content coming your way, and a subscription now gets you access to the RotoWire Football Draft Kit for free, and there are plenty of useful features to check out, including draft plans, pick suggestions, and insights on the rest of your league. I'm excited to test out the new features in my fantasy football drafts. I've already done some mock drafts. You'll see some content out there on social media today since it's hashtag mock draft Monday. And the code YouTube15 will get you the best price to try it out yourself. During today's show, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments and we'll get them answered. If you ask live, we'll get them answered on the show, but we'll also be active in the comments afterward to provide any additional insight. The injuries unfortunately continue to pile up around the league, and Aari McDonald has now been ruled out for the remainder of the season. The Fever signed Odyssey Sims as a result, and Kirien, do you see her being a factor the rest of the way?
Yes, she's a factor. She has to be, even if it's just the sense that we are aware of what she's doing, right? This is the fantasy playoffs now, so you got to be, locked in. And I don't think Sims will necessarily make or break your fantasy playoffs, but she could. And just that possibility means that we have to have all eyes on her. If you look at Indiana right now, after, Caitlin Clark has been out for a while, Christy Wallace isn't playing this season, you look at what's happening in the rotation right now after the Aari McDonald and Sydney Colson injuries. Chloe Bigby, Michaela Timpson, Brianna Turner, Damaris Dantas, these are all players that have been on the roster for a while and weren't really getting playing time, and now they're playing double-digit minutes. So no offense to them. They're developmental players. They're players that, Indiana has faith in that can, contribute or have potential. But right now the Fever need to win. They are 2.5 games ahead of the 9th seed, and 2 games they could jump, they could jump the standings too if they make a move here. But they're sliding. And so, they're going to prioritize Odyssey Sims and give her all the minutes that she can handle. And we saw what she could do in her limited action with the Sparks earlier in the season, 30-point game. So if you get one of those from a waiver wire pickup in the fantasy playoffs, that's going to go a long way. Obviously not guaranteeing that's going to happen, but that's definitely a possibility. And then I would just throw a wrench in here. The Fever are trailing, right? Or sliding down the standings. They may rush Clark back soon, and if they do that, Sims will probably lose all, if not most, if not all of her fantasy value.
I agree. I think Sims's fantasy value certainly hinges on when Caitlin Clark is back in action. And at this point, the answer is, unfortunately, we still just don't know. It could be any day. It could be several more weeks. If you look at Aari McDonald's and Odyssey Sims's stat lines, they're pretty similar, just over the course of the last few seasons. They average close to 10 points, around 4 assists, maybe 2 or so rebounds. For fantasy purposes, they're also very similar prototypes, I guess you would say, in the fact that they aren't necessarily players who are always guaranteed roster spots, especially in recent years. They aren't guaranteed roster spots in the WNBA. But whenever they are on a roster, they always seem to find their way into the rotation and carve out a fantasy relevant role. So I think that Odyssey Sims, once she is acclimated to her new team, I think that she'll be able to fill a very similar role that Aari McDonald did, again, provided that Caitlin Clark doesn't return anytime soon.
Yeah, 100%. You're absolutely right. And the other thing that I just would mention is that when a player like this comes in, there's no minutes restriction or if she's playing well, they're just going to run her into the ground, right? Not theoretically, right? Because she's not part of their championship plan. They just need her for this week or 2 weeks that Caitlin Clark is, Clark is going to remain sidelined. So I'm operating under the impression that her first game, maybe she plays 10, 15 minutes. But after that, they're going to need as many minutes as they can get out of Sims with all of the injuries. And that could be fantasy gold for us.
Absolutely. And like, especially at this time of year, any potential upside that you can find on the waiver wire is very important, because now that we're getting into the fantasy playoffs, the number of like relevant players will just be kind of depleted, because the teams that are paying attention in the league are probably still competing. Odyssey Sims right now is rostered in 9.5% of leagues. So there's a chance that like even if you're in a deeper like 10-team league, that she might still be available. So it's really possible that she could have a fantasy impact for you in the fantasy playoffs. You mentioned that the Fever are kind of on the lower half of the playoff picture right now. The team that is in the 9 slot as of right now is the Los Angeles Sparks. They've continued to make a push recently, and momentum is certainly on their side heading into the final month of the regular season, now that they are healthy. Do you see them as a playoff team at this point?
Yeah, I mean, the two teams ahead of them right now are the Seattle Storm and the Golden State Valkyries, and the Sparks have beat both of those teams. They have 3 wins over those two teams in the last 5 games. So yes, I think the Sparks have to at least be in the conversation, even if you aren't going to have them jump Golden State and Seattle right now. And well, after 5 straight losses, the Storm are on the verge of missing the playoffs. I don't want to rain on their downfall, but it's nice to see Dominique Malonga. We just did our first ever Dynasty WNBA draft, and I was kind of hesitant to take her number 2 overall, but I had to stick to my gun. She just wasn't playing at all. But the 19-year-old is finally bursting out of her bubble, even if Seattle's losing games. And it just, I was very concerned about Seattle heading into the season. I did not think they were a top, they were like the 2nd-tier team heading into the playoffs. I was still wrong about Phoenix, but this Seattle team, they're scrapping, and they just added Diggins to the mix, or Brittany Sykes to the mix to pair with Diggins. And I think they, could make a run here, but the organization of this team is funny to me. And I didn't see how they fit together. Obviously proved me wrong for a long time. And I think, as Sykes gets, adjusted to this team, Seattle could take a spot. But right now, Cameron Brink is playing 15 minutes a game and just absolutely dominating every time she's on the court. Azura Stevens has been fantastic. Hamby's been fantastic. Kelsey Plum has been great. Right now, I would take the Sparks over Golden State and Seattle.
Yeah, and your call on the Storm is just like one of those things where a lot of times you're almost a little too early on your calls. You called Nafisa Collier for MVP at least last year and maybe 2 years ago as well. Maybe just a little bit too early on that. And then the Storm you called during the preseason that you weren't quite buying what they were putting down. And they had a decent start to the season, but now they're sliding, and your prediction's coming true.
I always have to give up on my prediction for that to come true. So I'm right. I'm wrong both times, even though I was right the first time.
Right. Like, even if you are eventually right, like if you're just waving your fists during the times where it looks like you might be wrong, you just turn into the old man yells at cloud meme at a certain point. Exactly. And speaking of the Storm, Jeff Whiteley has a question. What teams should you stay away from for the fantasy playoffs? I think the Seattle Storm are definitely one of those teams. In addition to their current 5-game losing streak, I think that changes will potentially be coming to their rotation soon. We already saw it with Brittany Sykes taking a starting role over Erica Wheeler. I think Dominique Malonga might take a starting role over Ezzy Magbagor at a certain point. So I think that there's a lot of risk in those players. The Storm, like, over the past few years, they've had what really should amount to a super team with Skylar Diggins, Nneka Ogwumike, Gabby Williams. They have a lot of talent who probably should get you fantasy production. And if you have those players on your team, certainly continue to roll with them. But there are a lot of players who carry a lot of risk. So we talked about like Tiffany Mitchell, for example, earlier this season, who's a guard in Seattle. And now that the Storm are kind of shaking up their backcourt, she's a player who she might have certain games where she like really plays well, but I think that she will have a lot of inconsistency, and she's not necessarily a player to target for streaming purposes.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think the risk is just the big part of that. Like, yeah, Ezzy could start and she could drop 30, but maybe they have to make a dramatic change, and Malonga comes in, and all of a sudden you have Ezzy scores 5 or whatever. But yeah, Seattle is just a risky team right now with the way they're trending.
Yeah, and in the second half of the first round of the playoffs, so each playoff round is 2 weeks. So like this first round will be a 2-week format. Over the first half of it, they have 2 matchups against the Dream and a game against the Mercury, all of whom are pretty strong defenses. Now, in the second half, they face the Sky, the Wings, and the Mystics. So it should get a little bit easier in that second half if you want to kind of pivot next week into targeting more Storm players. But I think that at least for the first half of the week, I would steer clear of most Storm players. And thanks so much for that question. Staying on Seattle for a little bit, one Storm player who you certainly can target on the waiver wire is someone who we've been preaching all season, especially you, Kirien, is Dominique Malonga of the Storm, who is still rostered in just 31.2% of ESPN leagues. There seem to be growing calls for Malonga to replace Ezzy Magbagor in Seattle's starting lineup, which would presumably cause her fantasy production to skyrocket. If you're somehow in a league where Malonga is still available, she just needs to be rostered. Even though the Storm have a tough schedule coming up, Malonga is kind of at this point matchup proof, I would say. It seems as though Seattle will like try and get the ball into Malonga's hands however they can.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just this 2-game stretch. She's had 20 plus fantasy points in 6 of the last 8. And 18 and 15 in the other 2 games. So I think even if she continues to come off the bench, Malonga can provide strong fantasy production. And like we said, she's still a risky option, right? Like we're not saying, oh, pick up Malonga and she's going to carry you to your fantasy championship, but you at least need to take that chance, right? Like you can't be sitting here and being like, oh, well, what if she only plays 10 minutes off the bench? Like we're playing fantasy football, or we're playing fantasy basketball. We're playing WNBA fantasy basketball. This is gambling. You have to take a risk on a player as talented as Malonga, whose role could potentially grow from here.
Right. Unless if you had a draft where all of your front court options at this point are stellar contributors night in and night out. Unless if you have that sort of full lineup, Malonga is someone who should be in your lineup just because of that upside. And that upside is something that's rare to see at this juncture in the season, just because most of those players we've already been talking about for weeks and months on end. So they're already rostered. Malonga being rostered in just 31.2% of leagues is still baffling to me. I think that part of that is just like dormant leagues that are no longer active. But like if you're in any sort of format where she's still available, I would certainly pick her up. And I would say that she's probably past streaming at this point in my eyes. Like she's a player who you're going to want to keep on your bench just to plug and play whenever you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And just moving on to a couple of more players that are, younger players with a lot of potential. Aaliyah Edwards and Anissa Morrow should be rostered in more leagues. We're talking about 40% of rostership. Like that might be a lot of dormant leagues, might be, players not active because of they're out of the playoff picture or whatever. But Connecticut is at the bottom of the standings. They made a trade for Edwards. They gave her 20 minutes in the first game. Morrow has been playing 20 minutes. These are just 2 players that, not guaranteed to see elevated roles, but you have to take a risk on them. If they're available in your leagues, you're probably not going to find a better streaming candidate or a better, plug and play option than just picking these talented young players up and seeing what you get, rolling the dice on a week, on a game day where there's only a few games and Connecticut is playing, which happens to be tonight. So, that's a perfect way to start your fantasy round, right? Only one game today, not many players available, But if you have Edwards or Morrow available in your league, you can pick them up and get a quick 20-point boost on your opponent. I'm going to stick with streaming candidates for our waiver wire pickup this week, just because the schedule is kind of strange. There's, one game today, 2 games tomorrow, and then a bunch of games Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, and then only 1 game Saturday. So Monday, Tuesday, Saturday are our streaming days. The other days where there's games, there's just so many players playing that you're probably going to have a full starting lineup anyways. So for tonight, Connecticut, Golden State, tonight, Monday, Aaliyah Edwards and Anissa Morrow on Connecticut's side. And then on the flip side, Janelle Salon and Tebby Fagbenle. If you've listened to the show at all, you know that I like those players. Those players are rostered in 35% of leagues. So these are highly rostered streaming candidates, but they're still not rostered in every league or even more than half of leagues. So if they're available, go out, pick them up, try to get a head start on your opponent in the playoffs.
For sure. And because this is a 2-week matchup, you do have an increased amount of waiver ads this week. I think in standard leagues, I just checked the number seems to be 12.
Yeah, that's what I saw too.
Yeah, and so we talk sometimes about like trying to ambush your opponents by like stacking late in the week and just like making them feel comfortable, but then taking all of the available players late in the week. During the playoffs, it's a little bit of a different strategy, especially with this schedule over the next week. You're just going to kind of have to take what's given to you. And if you're using like even 6 or maybe a few more waiver ads this week, that's not a bad idea to build up a strong foundation this week. And then next week, try and have your opponent playing catch up while you are like still making the last few moves that you can.
Totally agree.
Those in deeper leagues might still be able to add Cecilia Zandalasini of the Valkyries. She's rostered in just 7.4% of leagues. You mentioned that Golden State plays tonight, so she's a solid streaming candidate. She's had an inconsistent role in the rotation for most of the year, but she's played a much larger role for the Valkyries, who have dealt with a lot of injuries recently, including at least 30 fantasy points in 2 of her last 3 appearances. Since Golden State has been shorthanded recently, it wouldn't be surprising to see her role continue to increase as the team attempts to hold on to a playoff spot. So she's someone who I think I would still put her in that streaming column where if you add her for tonight, I'm not necessarily stressing about dropping her for another player on Tuesday. But I think that she is someone who has the upside as evidenced by her recent production.
Yeah, the upside is totally there. And, it's just one of those things with Golden State where if she's playing well, she gets the minutes. If she's missing some shots, she doesn't quite get as many minutes. But, she's going to play 20-plus minutes, and you just hope that she connects on a couple from deep. So I love that option. And she's available in way more leagues than Salon or Fagbenle or Morrow or Edwards, like I mentioned. So my next, I'll just go to Tuesday's streaming slate. If you're looking to stream players for Tuesday, Dallas, Indiana, New York versus the Sparks. Misha Hines-Allen is only rostered in 20% of leagues. Her role has been growing. She missed some time, but she's played in 2 straight, and the minutes have been going up, trending in the right direction. And then you kind of got some players similar to Zandalasini, rostered in few percentages of leagues, but could, get hot for a night. That's Maddie Siegrist, Geisa Sloter, Haley Jones. Siegrist isn't starting, but she's probably the safest option of those 3. Geisa Sloter and Jones continue to start with, minor production, but it's still, 15, 20 points on a day where you weren't going to get any production could go a long way in the end. Indiana, you're looking at players like Lexi Hall or Odyssey Sims. Obviously, Odyssey Sims is probably the top waiver wire ad for both of us this week. Lexi Hall rostered in 29% of leagues, so she's one of those other players that just check to see if she's available. If she's available, you should go and add her with with all of the injuries we mentioned. The Chloe Bigby and Lexi Hall is playing 30 minutes a night and should be started in your fantasy playoffs. Moving on to the other game, New York versus the Sparks. New York has their players. Emma Miesman is rostered in like over 40% of leagues, so I didn't add her here. She was the Odyssey Sims of a couple of weeks ago, right? Other than that, you have Stephanie Talbot, Maureen Johannes, and Isabel Harrison. MJ is my favorite player in the league, but sadly, the fantasy production just isn't quite there. These are all Stephanie Talbot, Isabel Harrison, Marine Johannes are all just, shots in the dark. If you have a spot you're streaming and you just want to take a shot, you can stick with them. And then Julie Allman is only rostered in 13% of leagues for the Sparks. She's starting. She's playing 30-plus minutes. The production isn't fantastic, but definitely a candidate worthy of streaming tomorrow on the 2-game slate. And then the longest of shot is Ray Burrell and for the Sparks. She's been playing consistent minutes off the bench. She's basically, if Cameron Brink is the 6th person, Burrell is the 7th, and even sometimes they swap. So she's just a strong candidate for minutes on a team that's trending in the right direction, due in part because of her spark plug off the bench. So those are just a handful of players that you could stream for Tuesday. I would probably, Sims is at the top of my list, followed by Hall, Misha Hines-Allen, and then I would probably go either Segrist or Almond if you wanted me to rank them.
For sure. And you mentioned that Emma Misaman doesn't really qualify for your specifications now that she's rostered over 40% of leagues. Julie Almond is a player who's also a guard, also just kind of a legacy player in the WNBA. She's been around for several years, but just hasn't played in the W recently. But their production has been pretty similar over their last few appearances. Misaman maybe has just a tick more upside, but over Almond's last 3 games in standard ESPN scoring, she scored 22, 19, and 33 points, whereas Misaman has scored 25, 37, and 25. So, Misaman will get you just an extra couple of points per night, but I don't think that slight increased production warrants the significant jump between the two teams, especially since the Sparks will be fighting for playoff position. So the Liberty are certainly trying to hold on to the 2 seed, but with the Sparks, they'll just have more motivation to play their starters really as long as they need to in games. The Liberty, if they're up big, maybe they'll rest some of their players because they aren't in as dire of a situation. But with the Sparks, I could see them trying to make very well sure that the game is put away before they start putting in some of their bench players. So Alaman could have similar production to Misaman down the stretch. So I think that she's certainly a player to watch both as a streaming candidate, and if you just have an open roster spot due to an IR player, maybe hold on to Alaman. And for as much as we have kind of ribbed on the Sun and the Wings a little bit this year, like you mentioned, Aaliyah Edwards and Anissa Morrow, and certainly Dallas has several players worthy of picking up this week, including Grace Berger, who is on a short-term contract. She hasn't started and hasn't had massive production, but if you're just looking for a few extra points, she's also a player who could perform well. And the thing with Connecticut and Dallas at this point is because they're so out of the playoff picture, they'll probably be in a lot of lopsided matchups, but they won't necessarily have the motivation to rest their key players in those games just because they're in development mode. So a lot of the players that we've talked about are younger players who could really use the experience at the WNBA level. So if you have them on your fantasy rosters, it's not necessarily going to be a fun watch, if you're turning the game on, but it will be fun to probably watch those fantasy points pile up consistently.
Yeah, totally 100% agreed. The last thing I would say, going back to Almond, is that her triple-double the other week, you would think that would warrant you a boost in rostership. Come on, fellas. But the other thing is, I was talking Zandalasini, we're talking about, when she gets hot, the minutes are there. Julie is starting, and since coming into the starting lineup has played fewer than 30 minutes only 3 times, and one of those times she played 29 minutes. So it's not even, sometimes it's if they get the minutes, their production will come. It's she gets the minutes no matter what. It's just a matter of if the production is there too.
For sure. And staying on some of the lower teams in the league, Elizabeth Williams of the Sky has drawn most of the attention in Angel Reese's absence, but the time to add Williams appears to have passed. She's now rostered in 67% of leagues. However, two other Sky forwards have been quietly productive over the past few games, as Maddie Westbeld and Michaela Onyenwere have both scored double-digit fantasy points in 3 of their last 4 appearances. Now, each of their outings in double figures ended in a double-digit loss for Chicago, but the Sky will likely continue to be in plenty of lopsided matchups down the stretch. Onyenwere is rostered in just 2.5% of leagues, while Westbeld is rostered in 0.4%. So both players are probably available basically everywhere, and they're under the radar pickups who could provide you a boost in the fantasy playoffs. Neither of them really have the upside that Elizabeth Williams would have, but if you can get like somewhere between 10 and 15 points or so, that could make the difference by the end of the week.
Totally agree. We haven't really heard anything about Angel Reese coming back anytime soon, so you got to ride with the hot hand while you can.
For sure.
The last, Friday was the last other streaming day that I said, not Friday. Saturday was the last streaming day because there's only one game. It's the Liberty against the Lynx, a rematch of Sunday's game. And I already mentioned some of the Liberty players that you could stream, but Jessica Shepard, no word on Collier yet back either. So if you are looking for a streaming candidate on Saturday, Jessica Shepard would be the top option. She's rostered only 25% of leagues and has been absolute stud while Collier has been out. And, I was going to bring this up earlier, but when we were talking about Malonga and adding unless your front court was just super stacked. But look at the injuries to the front court right now. You got Collier out. You got Stewart out. There's some Brittany Griner's missed a lot of time recently, who just came back this weekend. But I feel like there's a lot of teams that need a lot of help heading into the fantasy playoffs, and hopefully we provided them with some options. And Jessica Shepard is definitely one of those top options.
Absolutely. And closing out like some of the waiver wire talks, Chunchilla has a question. The Lynx's schedule has kind of put him in a bind this week. Put them in a bind this week, as most of the players are too good to drop, but they're curious as to who has the best schedule to us in terms of games played or opponent based. One team that meets the billing for both categories this week is the Valkyries. They have 4 games between tonight and Sunday. Early in the week, they face off against the Sun tonight, and then Wednesday is against the Mystics, who's kind of a middle of the pack opponent. Friday is against the Sky, and assuming Angel Reese remains sidelined, that should be a pretty favorable matchup, even though it's in Chicago. And then it gets a little tougher on Sunday as they have a game against the Dream, who have a pretty solid defense. But the Valkyries have a schedule that has a lot of games and favorable opponents. And for the team, for the Valkyries, who have struggled a bit more than usual lately, I think that if they are hoping to make a run in the playoffs, make a run toward the playoffs, that this is the week where they really need to have the rubber meet the road and probably, given their schedule, try and walk away with at least 3 wins this week. So I think that they will be full steam ahead, and really any of the players who we talked about early in the show are certainly worth picking up for the Valkyries.
Yeah, it's hilarious. I was going to say the same thing when I saw the question. Golden State is definitely the right answer for this week. But it's just hilarious that this team that has been so frustrating for fantasy all year long, different roster, different rotations, different players coming and going from, Eurobasket or AmeriCup or whatever it was. And now they're the team that everybody needs, players off of. And I think that it's the perfect storm, because with the changing rotations, there are candidates to stream, because they're, that's like the Seattle, your starters, all your starters are rostered. So it's kind of difficult to stream those kind of players in. But yeah, I think optimizing your Golden State usage this week and exposure this week is going to be key into getting a good head start in your fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and another team that could have some especially streaming value over the next 2 weeks during this playoff round is the Chicago Sky. They have a matchup against the Sun on the road Wednesday, which out of all the opponents Chicago could face, Connecticut is probably one of the more favorable games. Next Tuesday, they have a game against the Storm at home, and then they face the Sun again on Saturday, August 23rd, which is just before the end of this first round. So they do have matchups against the Liberty and against the Valkyries sprinkled in there. So they aren't necessarily a team to play their players all week, but like especially those certain matchups, they could really have some value.
For sure.
And then another question, thoughts on dropping Wheeler, Banham, or even Hayes for Malonga? I think that that would be a very valid thing to do, especially Erica Wheeler. She lost her starting role last night and fell to just 13 ESPN fantasy points. I think that Malonga at this point has a lot more upside. Wheeler should still have a bit of a role, but I think that Malonga will definitely be featured a lot more over the next few weeks.
Yeah, I would say that Banham and Hayes have higher upsides than Wheeler as well. But Wheeler might be a little more consistent than Banham. I would definitely drop one of these three players, and it would probably be Erica Wheeler, and go for the upside of Banham, Hayes, and Malonga.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for those questions. And as we mentioned, this week will be slightly quieter than usual around the WNBA, including the off day Thursday. The inconsistent scheduling means that it'll be especially important to stream players in the quieter slates. But what are some of the top matchups that you're looking forward to this week?
Yeah, the Liberty have a very tough week. They play the Red Hot Sparks Tuesday, then the Surging Aces on Wednesday during a back-to-back. So that'll be a tough back-to-back, two of the hottest teams in the league. And then they go play Minnesota on Sunday after losing to them, or on Saturday after losing to them this past Sunday. Liberty have been treading water without Breanna Stewart. They're tied with the Atlanta now. It's going to be difficult for these teams, the Sparks and Aces, to maintain their winning streaks against the Liberty, because the Liberty are still putting out a tough product every week or every game. But the Liberty aren't quite the contenders that they're going to need to be to win the championship, right? They need to get Stewie back involved. Kennedy Burke and Nira Savali have missed some time too. They're quality reserve options. So I'm going to be zeroed in on the Liberty from a fan aspect and seeing how they move up and down the standings this week, and see if the Sparks and Aces cool off a little bit. It's going to be like, from a fan perspective, the standings moving up and down. We talked about Seattle and Atlanta earlier this week. Seattle is going to has a couple tough matchups against Atlanta, and they could go up and down. New York could go up and down. It's going to be survival of the fittest here over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and one team that I'll be zeroing in on is Seattle. As we've mentioned, the Storm have been in a bit of a free fall recently, in the midst of a 5-game losing streak, and their schedule doesn't get much easier this week, with 2 matchups against the Dream and 1 against the Mercury. Even though I think that Brittany Sykes will help the team, it feels as though Seattle needs to win at least 1 game this week to remain firmly in the mix for the playoffs. And if they lose out, I don't think it would be surprising to see them on the outside looking in come next week's show.
Yeah, it seems like, just looking at the standing, it's just teams of trends right now. Seattle lost 5 straight, Aces win 4 straight, Lynx win 5 straight. Those can change quickly. Obviously, momentum. We could go on for another half hour about whether momentum is real or not. If you watch the Brewers at all, if you watch the Cubs at all, you can tell that momentum is probably real the way those two teams are trending. But yeah, it's going to be a very fun week. I feel like, every time we get on here and we start talking about players and talking about teams, expansion is just, it's needed. We're talking about Odyssey Sims not being on a roster, and then she comes in and she could be a fantasy league winner. You talk about Golden State not making the playoffs. Like, Golden State has had one of the best for an inaugural season. This could go, like, the storylines and everything from this Valkyrie season are absolutely incredible, and they might miss the playoffs. Seattle has it's crazy how tough the WNBA is right now, and it doesn't really make projecting fantasy that any easier.
For sure. It should definitely be a very entertaining final month of the regular season with all the jostling for playoff position. And that does it for today's show. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next Monday, August 18th. at 1 p.m. Central. Be sure to join us then.